Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to Ihsancast episode 8. And today, as promised, we've got Shaykh Asrar Rashid with us. And if you tuned into the previous video where I did a book review of this new release, Islam Answers Atheism, by the Shaykh. And as promised, we said that we would have a longer podcast discussing the book in a lot more depth and a lot more detail. Just to give a bit of background on Shaykh Asrar. Shaykh Asrar is a senior lecturer of the Islamic sciences, focusing in specialization in Islamic theology. He's been lecturing up and down the country for numerous years, as well as engaging in academic debates, and he's translated works in Arabic grammar and etymology, and this is, of course, his latest release, Islam Answers Atheism. So, Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh. Hope you're well.
Wa alaikum assalam rahmatullah. How are you?
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. It's been a while since I've seen you, so it's nice speaking to you.
Alhamdulillah. Yes.
Yes, so just discussing the new book, of course, and I've obviously had a read of it. I did a book review of it. I obviously expressed my feelings that it was a really necessary work that, alhamdulillah, has been very well executed. I was just wondering if we could just start off by explaining, why did you choose the Kalam methodology? And is it the best tool or the best methodology you could use to tackle or answer atheists' objections against Islam?
So, what I intended to demonstrate by elucidating on the Kalam methodology is to demonstrate that the Kalam methodology is not outdated. Some people think it's something from antiquity that has no relevance in the modern age. So, in the first chapter and the second chapter, there is a clear elucidation with regard to the relevance of Kalam. So, an historical background with regard to how Kalam was utilized as a tool to dismantle fallacious arguments or arguments that ostensibly are strong arguments, but when the Kalam methodology, when they are exposed to the Kalam methodology or the Kalam methodology is utilized against them, those arguments fall apart. So the first chapter does cover some of the history of how in the past Muslims encountered so many variant groups and various heresies, and those heresies were dismantled through the Kalam methodology. But then toward the end of the first chapter, there is also the relevance of Kalam today and the fallacious arguments that are presented against Islam. So this is why I chose the Kalam methodology, to say that it's a methodology that has survived the test of time, and it still survives today and is still very relevant to Muslims, and they must return back to the Kalam methodology. Additionally, the second chapter on epistemology covers the practical nature of the Kalam methodology. And of course, the case examples, the modern case examples, are then in chapter 3, 4, and 5, and 6, where we have modern case examples, and the method being applied is the Kalam methodology. So it's essential that the reader becomes acquainted with the history of the Kalam methodology, which is covered in chapter 1, and the tools that are utilized in the Kalam methodology, which is covered in chapter 2. And the reason why I chose the Kalam methodology is because of its tried and tested aspect, and it has never failed Muslims. And additionally, I wanted to demonstrate to the modern reader that the Kalam classical rational Islamic theology is still relevant even to the modern scientific mind, or even the materialistic mind.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting you say that, and inshallah we'll get on to the kind of differences between the Western methodology and of course the Kalam methodology. But there is you know you've mentioned actually some of the stories about Imam al-Ashari and Imam al-Razi, almost quote unquote claiming, is a claim from some Muslims that they repented from utilizing the Kalam methodology. I was just wondering if you could explain that in a bit more detail, because this is one of the points of contention amongst Muslims, which of course you know about, is the fact that some of them will say, well, there is no need to use it, or in fact you are wrong in using the Kalam methodology, and look at two of the propagators of it, of course one of them being Imam al-Ashari and the other one being the great Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi. They quote unquote repented. It seems to always be a deathbed repentance for some reason, but they repented from using this methodology. So could you kind of explain that and
Well,
respond to that?
with regard to Al-Imam Abu al-Hasan Ali bin Ismail al-Ash'ari rahimahullah ta'ala, the claim is that he went through 5 stages in his life, but the Sunni Muslims state that he actually only went through 2 stages. One was the first stage of where he was trained in the Mu'tazili creed. Up to the age of 40, he was a specialist in the Mu'tazili creed, a staunch defender of the Mu'tazili creed. And after the age of 40, when he really confounded his teacher, Abu Ali al-Jubai, with regard to some internal inconsistencies found within Mu'tazili Kalam, this led to Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari rahimahullah repenting from Mu'tazili Kalam. Mu'tazili Kalam should be distinct from Sunni Kalam. Sunni Kalam is an actual defense of the Quran and Sunnah as it is, according to the consensus of the companions and those after them. The Mu'tazili Kalam, on the other hand, it tackles heresy of atheism by rejecting some of the explicit verses of the Quran relating to miracles, as well as rejecting the ahadith and the sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So traditional Sunni Kalam was a method of defending the Quran and Sunnah and in accordance with the understanding of the Salaf, as-Salafu Salihun, the pious predecessors. So Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari only had 2 phases, but Abu al-Abbas Ahmad bin Taymiyyah, the famous Damascene theologian, Hanbali theologian, he invented or proposed a 5-stage transitional period for Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, which the Ash'ari reject, meaning the scholars who follow the methodology of Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, they accept the works like Al-Ibana an Usul al-Diyana, which is ascribed to Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, even though they say some of the manuscripts have been tampered. But Abu al-Abbas Ahmad bin Taymiyyah proposed a 5-stage transitional period for Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari. But this is rejected by the majority of the scholars who say he only went through 2 stages. So this revisionism has been continued by some of the pseudo-Salafi scholars. For instance, today, some of them claim that even Al-Imam al-Nawawi or Al-Imam Ibn Hajar were not Ash'ari. But they say at the same time, Al-Imam al-Nawawi, his commentary on Sahih Muslim al-Minhaj, has the Ash'ari positions. And Ibn Hajar, his Fath al-Bari, has the Ash'ari positions on the names and attributes. They accept this, but then they go and make a distinction. They say, but these were hadith scholars who lived in a time where the Ash'aris were the dominant sect, and therefore they just happened to adopt those positions, as if to say, a learned scholar like Al-Imam al-Nawawi and a learned scholar like Ibn Hajar would not have been familiar with the position of a Salafu Salihun until the modern pseudo-Salafi sect appears and can explain what the actual Salaf believed in. So this, of course, is ludicrous. And they also claim this revisionism for Al-Imam al-Juwayni, Abu Ma'ali Abdul Malik al-Juwayni, the teacher of Al-Imam al-Ghazali. And they claim this regarding Al-Imam al-Ghazali. So it's not only Al-Imam Fakhruddin Razi. how they claim this regarding Al-Imam al-Ghazali, they say that he wrote his book Iljam al-Awam an Ilm al-Kalam, preventing the lay people from delving into Kalam. So they say, look, he adopted the creed of the Salaf. But this, of course, is incorrect. Iljam al-Awam is written to prevent the lay people from entering Kalam, because as I cover in chapter 1, I mentioned the quote from Imam Ghazali where he says, Kalam is like a medicine that should only be taken proportionately to the illness. That as long as the ailment is there or the illness is there, then a person indulges in Kalam in order to remove any of those rational queries that they may have or doubts. And Kalam is a preventative medicine to remove those doubts. But when medicine is taken in large doses for people who are not sick or not ill, it becomes an illness. So this was what Imam Ghazali was saying. And when he says, when they mention they abandon ta'wil, any of these scholars, if they say they abandon ta'wil, they do not mean that as a condemnation of the ta'wil which is done, which what these pseudo-Salafis do today is they confuse the ta'wil of the Asha'ira with the ta'wil of the Mu'tazila. The Mu'tazila would negate the entire attribute. The Asha'ira do not negate divine attributes. This is one major distinction. The Mu'tazila did not ascribe to Allah any attribute. So they say, for instance, Allah is all seeing with his essence. Allah is all hearing with his essence. While the Ash'aris affirmed attributes for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the pseudo-Salafi movement then claimed they only affirm 7 attributes. This is also incorrect. The Ash'aris affirm all the attributes for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but they say it's essential on the public, the common people, to know 20 attributes. But the attributes of Allah are endless. So a third distinction between the Mu'tazila and the Asha'ira is when the Asha'ira do ta'wil, what the Ash'aris mean by ta'wil is that any divine attribute that is mentioned, but the meaning is unspecific. Within the valid interpretations, they specify one interpretation, but not with certainty. Not with certainty. This is referred to as ta'wil. So for instance, the word istawa, the verb istawa, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ar-Rahmanu ala al-arshi istawa. The merciful is the one who made istiwa upon the throne. And 6 times in the Quran, the istiwa is ascribed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The Asha'ira affirm this for Allah as one of the divine actions, but they negate that which is impossible. And then within the possible meanings, some of them, not all, will specify a meaning, but not with certainty. So the early Hanbalis would condemn anyone who would specify a meaning with certainty. But the Ash'aris did not specify a meaning with certainty. So when Al-Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali or Al-Imam al-Juwayni, they say, we adopt the creed of the Salaf, what that means is we leave the meaning to Allah, the specific meaning to Allah, but we accept and acknowledge all the divine attributes for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there is a propaganda today amongst the pseudo-Salafi movement where they are equating the Asha'ira with the followers of Ja'ad bin Dirham, or the followers of Al-Jubba'i, or the early Mu'tazila like Wasil bin Ata, and other notorious heretical sects in that early period, when in fact the Ash'ari position is one of the positions of As-Salaf Salihun. The first position is that the specific meaning is left to Allah. And the second position is that sometimes a meaning can be specified at the time of necessity, like Al-Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal specified the meaning of Al-Maji, arrival of Allah, as being his divine command. This is Al-Imam Ahmad specifying a meaning. So, but when these meanings are specified, the Asha'ira say it is not specified with certainty. As for Al-Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi, rahimahullah, if you remember in the book, I mentioned Al-Imam Fakhruddin as saying that we accept the religion of the old women. And people think this is his repentance from Sunni ilm al-kalam.
Yeah.
But in reality, this was Al-Imam Fakhruddin al-Razi saying that what is known in religion by necessity to such a degree that even the old women know this is what we adopt as our religion because it's so well known from the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. What he was not saying is that we have a blind faith or an irrational faith, because those who have a blind faith or an irrational approach to religion will always fall into doubt. So this, your listeners, if they refer to the book in chapter 1, this is covered extensively.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that was it was very important just to clear that up before we actually go into the Kalam methodology itself, because a lot of people have doubts of whether or not they should be reading books of Kalam or even looking into the Kalam methodology. So
also recently, Abdurrahman Hassan, he misquoted Al-Imam Muhammad bin Yusuf al-Sunusi rahimallah, for instance. So Al-Imam al-Sunusi says that a person cannot follow. This is how he misquotes. He misquotes him as saying that Al-Imam al-Sunusi says that you cannot follow the Quran and Sunnah directly. But this is not what Al-Imam al-Sunusi says. I believe he misquotes him because he reads from secondary sources with regard to the Asharis. Al-Imam al-Sunusi says that you cannot believe in the Quran and Sunnah bada'an, from the very beginning, except through a rational basis. That you believe in a God, and then you believe that the God has sent down revelation, and you believe in the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But at the same time, if someone even refers to the Sharh al-Kubra of Al-Imam Sunusi, they will find that Al-Imam Sunusi states anyone who just follows Quran and Sunnah, it's sufficient for them. If, for instance, there's a Muslim layperson who says, whatever is in the Quran and Sunnah, I believe, and I do not need to look into these rational sciences, that is valid. But the need for rationality arises when people start doubting the Quran and Sunnah, or when someone needs to adopt belief in the Quran and Sunnah, meaning a person who is investigating for the first time. Secondly, he misquotes the Ash'ari position, where the Ash'aris, the late Ash'aris, they say that the first obligation on a person is investigation. So what they interpret, meaning the pseudo-Salafis, they say the Ash'aris are calling for people to doubt, that they should doubt first and then investigate. But again, this is a misrepresentation of their views. So anyone who hears these type of things should always verify with the original sources.
Inshallah. And just kind of moving on from, of course, Muslim attacks against Kalam, and generally actually now the atheists themselves. So we see people like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins. And I mean, from my reading of reading Harris's works or Dawkins's works, there's definitely seems to be a clear and systematic attack against Islam and against the Muslims in particular. And I found this very strange because of the fact that, I mean, as an atheist, surely you should be, against all religions, because you don't believe in any religion. But I mean, Harris in particular, and you've mentioned some tweets of Dawkins in the book as well. But when you read their books, they will mention things like, Islam will be the thing that will cause the clash of civilizations. It will be the thing that will bring the West down to its knees. So we need to stop it. We need to prevent it as much as possible. So, I mean, why do you think it's the case that they, in particular, constantly pick Islam as being the religion to attack in the West, when there are lots of other religions?
The reason for that is because Islam has an alternative political system to the democratic cooperative or banking system that runs the West today, meaning this neoliberalism or selective human rights approach that we have in the West. Islam gives an alternative, not only in terms of crime and punishment but also in terms of judiciary, in terms of governance, economic system. Islam has an alternative lifestyle. So unlike Buddhism or Christianity or Hinduism, Islam has an entire economic system. So we know, for instance, economically, if people adopted the Islamic economic system, the banking system, including the IMF, the World Bank, the American National Treasury, all these bodies will be affected by an Islamic system of governance, which will bring people back to real currency of gold and silver, remove interest and usury. What the IMF does is by loaning, giving out big loans to developing countries, developing because they were pillaged in the first place by those same Western nations. And then when they left the post-colonial period, or the neo-colonial period, has a new way of colonizing those same places like South Africa and other parts of Africa and Asia. So Islam gives an alternative to those people and gives an alternative to people in the West. So when they talk about clash of civilizations, civilization cannot clash with civilization. One is civilization and the other is barbaric. So they view Islam as barbaric, while Muslims view corporal capitalism as barbaric in how it destroys countries through loans, which people, when they cannot pay back loans, what do? They plunder resources. And they will not only plunder resources, they will cut down rainforests to make land for farming, excessive farming, which then makes a desertification of the land. The land is no longer fertile, it becomes desert. The lungs of the world are burnt down, or cut. The wood is cut down to sell. Why do they need to go to such extremes? To pay back loans to a banking system. But Islam has an alternative economic system. It has morality and ethics, which are not found amongst New Atheism. I mean, New Atheism does not have an alternative ethical code. They may claim a humanist philosophy, but humanist philosophy is not fixated in terms of its ethical code.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever, if you remember Lawrence Krauss, for instance, accepting incest as something acceptable as long as it doesn't lead to pregnancy and deformity in birth. So Islam is seen as a threat because Islam has an alternative to what the West has to offer. And therefore Islam needs to be made out to be barbaric. And the way it is made out to be barbaric is through Sharia law. So this is why in the chapter I cover extensively, in chapter 6, Sharia law. Or theologically speaking, or metaphysically speaking, God needs to be made out to be a despotic Saddam Hussein, or a cosmic dictator. And therefore in chapter 4 I covered the problem of evil and why God creates evil and whatnot. So Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins really see Islam as a threat, because Islam has an alternative political system, and it's not just a belief. And this is why today Muslims in China, the Uyghur Muslims, for instance, face heavy punishment from the Chinese government, or a brainwashing totalitarian camps of thought reform, where thought reform is carried out. And the Chinese are well renowned for thought reform, brainwashing, because those Uyghurs are seen as a threat, because Islam itself has an alternative to Chinese communism, or the communism that China has today. But what will happen, as happens every 100 years, is within those same regions Islam rises again. So like Russian communism in the past 100 years attempted to extinguish Islam from Central Asia, Islam has arisen in those areas again. So Islam never finishes. The light of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is never extinguished. But the response to your question is that they see Islam as a political, existential political threat, or an ontological reality that they must face as an alternative to corporate capitalism, or what they refer to as democracy, which in reality it's a form of hypocrisy, because when Palestinians vote in Hamas as their official government, Hamas is removed. So the democracy goes down the drain whenever it suits them.
Yeah. I mean, it was just also interesting because of the fact that, you're talking about Islam and offers a genuine alternative. I mean, do you think that, partly one of the questions that I did want to ask is that, you've seen the collapse of other religions, in particular in for instance, the United Kingdom, where, the rise of atheism is on the rise. I don't think that there's any doubt about it. Many people would say we're in a post-religious country. The ones who do believe or would say there's obviously, agnostics or Christians who aren't necessarily practicing. Whereas, to be fair to the Muslims, you do still see a lot of people still attending the mosque. You still see a lot of people engaging with the religion. Of course, not as many as we would want, but there still is in comparison to other religions, there still is a sense of attachment to the religion that you don't see in others. Do you possibly think that that is also why they are? I mean, because that's one thing that I've always thought about. Do you think that's also possibly one of the reasons why they are, in particular, pinpointing Islam?
See, many times people mention Islam is suffering globally, meaning suffering politically, or there's a political weakness of Muslims. But I have always advocated that Islam is always thriving, even when Muslims are at their weakest. So we have the Hajj every year. When the Hajj is carried out, we have the Quran being recited in the East and the West. Just the adhan alone, the adhan. At every given moment in the world, the adhan happens. Meaning, as the globe turns on its axis, there is someone in the globe giving adhan and the prayer is being established. This alone shows the spiritual dominance of Islam, which already exists. So this frightens those people who are enemies of Islam, like the likes of Modi, for instance, in India. Why does he need to be frightened of Islam? Even though what I am advocating in the book is that this is an unsubstantiated fear of Islam. The fear is unsubstantiated. It's a fear of the diminishing nature of one's own faith, or one's own moral relativism, which what these guys have, Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, meaning that will be dissipated if Islam becomes the dominant religion adopted by people. So a propaganda campaign, a smear campaign, was started after 9/11, even though the smear campaign goes down into history. When, if you remember in the introduction, I mentioned, or in chapter 1, the Prime Minister Gladstone from the Victorian time, who was Prime Minister 3 times, who condemned the Quran and blamed the Quran for resistance in Egypt. So when they were colonizing Egypt, they faced resistance and they blamed the Quran. So Muslims still have this strong resistance. Why do they have resistance? The 1857 mutiny in India was mainly led by Muslims like Fadlullah Khairabadi and other ulama. Likewise, the resistance against the French in Syria was led by Al-Imam Badruddin al-Hassani. The resistance of Al-Imam Shamil, the resistance of Umar al-Mukhtar in Libya against the fascist Mussolini, and likewise resistance throughout the times and history. Why do Muslims have resistance? Because of their religion. if there was no Islam in those regions, there would not be any resistance to globalization today. So the globalization that we are observing today, the real resistance, the ideological resistance and political resistance is Islam. So this is one of the reasons why Islam is feared. But like I said, it's unsubstantiated in terms of they're categorizing Islam as a barbaric religion which condones suicide bombings and terrorism. And this is why I touch upon the topic of jihad in chapter 6.
Yeah. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. So let's actually move on now to the crux of it, which is the Kalam methodology. And could you just give us a brief overview of the Kalam methodology as utilized in this book in chapter 2?
So chapter 2, which most people found the most difficult chapter on epistemology. So many people are even unfamiliar of the term epistemology unless they've taken up a course in A levels or in university where they learn the word epistemology. I mentioned in the beginning of chapter 2 that it's from the word episteme in Greek, and it refers to the approach to knowledge, meaning what approach do we take in ascertaining facts. And the Islamic Kalam methodology has always taken a combination of two approaches. One is the rational approach, and the second is the approach which is referred to as the external approach, which relates to the senses. So al-hawas is the senses. Al-hawas al-khamsa al-zahira is the 5 outward senses. So the rational approach is that judgment which we can form regarding any given subject solely through the mind, while the material method of ascertaining facts is from the external faculties like eyesight, hearing, touching, taste, and smell. These are two ways of ascertaining facts. The third is a combination of both. So something can be rationally and materially or tangibly determined, and a combination of both. So the chapter 2 expands on the method of the mind, which is the rational judgments, and the method of the faculties, which is especially the sight and the hearing, and the third method, which is a combination of both. So we ascertain, for instance, through mass transmission also, that Paris, for instance, is the capital of France. How do we attain this? Tangibly, we know this through people who tell us, even if we haven't traveled to Paris, we would know through people who have informed us after their visit to France that Paris actually exists. This gives us certainty with regard to the existence of Paris. So this is covered in substantial detail, but then at the end of chapter 2, there is a comparison with this methodology and the various philosophers, the European philosophers, Western philosophers, and how they approached attaining knowledge. So there is a cross comparison between the two, and their method being more skeptical or imparting skepticism, while the Kalam methodology imparts certainty, and we only act upon certainty.
Just, I mean, one point that we see come up in that part that you're talking about in particular is the idea of the fact that empirical judgments rule, so to speak, in today's day and age. So, for instance, Harris will talk about empirical judgments being the be all and end all. In fact, even in his book, The Moral Landscape, he almost, well, he does, in fact, he basically advises that through empirical judgments and through data, we can come up with objective morality. We can come up with laws which are objectively moral, so to speak, in his work, The Moral Landscape. And, you know, what is the problem with using empirical judgments for everything like Harris is doing? You know,
So
maybe we
here,
can touch on
firstly,
David Hume as well.
with regard to his statement on empirical judgments being the sum of all knowledge, this had this idea had huge influence in the early 1900s in Europe. So you had logical positivism, where they believed science can determine everything from what we observe in the physical realm, but also objective morality. And this idea lost sway in the 1960s. So in the 1960s, the idea began to diminish in academic circles. Why? Because it's never a fruition in terms of delivery. In terms of delivery, how can we deliver morality to humanity through science? The combination of both is barren, meaning it doesn't give any actual morality to humankind. So it can never be established. So Sam Harris is actually just regurgitating outdated ideas, the ideas of A.J. Ayer and the logical positivists, which I mentioned in the book also in the 1900s. These are outdated arguments. Even the likes of these type of philosophers, or those influenced by this methodology, there is no morality in their lives. When you read with regard to the way they live their lives, if you read the autobiography of if you read the autobiography of Bertrand Russell, in there how he committed adultery. You read in recently Michel Foucault, the French philosopher, the revelations regarding him. And even when he was alive, he wasn't a moral individual. You read on all these various philosophers, they have no actual code of morality and ethics. Yes, there are religious people who will have no morals and ethics also. And I covered this also on religious hypocrisy. So that aspect is covered about religious hypocrisy. But nevertheless, they ascribe to a moral and ethical code, even if they themselves may fall short of practicing that moral and ethical code. So objective morality can never exist through science and has never been demonstrated. So this Sam Harris is an advocate, or if not an advocate, he at least hosts someone who advocates pseudoscience, like saying the intelligence quotient, IQ, is less in certain ethnic races. He defended this idea, and I mentioned this in the introduction. So discrimination of certain races based upon pseudoscience can lead to the type of events we saw with eugenics in Germany, in Hitler's Germany, and eugenics even in the UK in the 1800s, where they would measure the cranium of various working class people, and by the size of their cranium determine their intelligence, which was actual pseudoscience. So, and this science was then debunked later. So who is to control the moral objectivity? Who is to tell us that this is morally correct? And there are many examples of this aside from eugenics in human history, where pseudoscience was considered actual science, and then decades later was debunked. But by then the misery and the crimes that these people had carried out was done away with, meaning finished. There was no accountability of any type.
But what about I mean, the science side of things, but what about? I mean, when you read his works, it kind of clearly seems to be kind of massively influenced by people like John Stuart Milne and the whole idea of utilitarianism. And I was just thinking to myself, we've seen the negative effects of things like utilitarianism in, Stalin's Russia, Mao's Republic of China. That and as you've mentioned, regarding eugenics. I mean, what kind of world do they almost want to live in where it is very much, kind of survival of the fittest using pseudoscience, or there is enforcing the rule of what is best for the majority onto the minority? And if that means that there are some people who suffer, then those people suffer, and they're almost just, uh, you know, left
At
to
the
the
bottom of
wayside.
the food chain.
Yeah, at the bottom of the food chain, and it doesn't matter. They were almost kind of like, as long as the majority are okay, that's what we care about. I mean, what kind of world? I mean, who would want to live in such a world?
Well, this new atheism is being pushed to maintain the ascendancy of the status quo that has been acquired for the past 500 years. So since the trade routes, when the trade routes changed, previously the trade routes were from China through the Silk Route to Istanbul, Constantinople at that time.
Hmm.
And in the 1450s, when Sultan Muhammad al-Fatih conquered Constantinople, Muslims acquired much of the wealth that would enter the trade route. But those trade routes were changed from 1492, when Columbus supposedly set sail from Spain in order to find India, and he found America instead. And likewise, Vasco da Gama, who found the trade route around Africa, and they avoided the Silk Route. And the wealth then could be acquired from lands which were filled with native and indigenous people who did not have the weaponry and sophistication to fight the white man at the time.
Hmm.
The white man gained all this wealth from plundering those countries, and there is a status quo now and they done away with Christianity at that time also. So you had the Reformation. First they done away with Catholicism, then after the French Revolution they done away with Christianity and religion as a whole. And this is why you would find that the French are some of the most brutal people on the face of the earth, meaning the French government, some of the most brutal people on the face of the earth in terms of even the nuclear tests they did in the 1950s in Africa. So to maintain that status quo, you need an ideology that is ostensibly rational. Ostensibly, it has some rational basis to justify the inhumane behavior of the rulers and the governing elite. While in Islam, everyone has accountability. So Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu, when he was caliph, people would take him to account. The famous story of Sayyidina Ali radiallahu anhu, when he was caliph, the Jewish man took him to court. A Jewish man who was a minority within the Muslim caliphate took the caliph to court, and he won the case. So the judge gave the judgment in the favor of the Jew. And then the Jew said he had made the whole thing up in order to test the justice system. And he wasn't punished for this. He wasn't even punished for doing so. So Islam has accountability, a moral code, an ethical code that is fixated. You can never justify certain evils, unlike the philosophy advocated by the likes of Sam Harris. It can change over time, whatever suits the status quo. So I believe this is being promulgated to maintain the status quo, the Anglosphere, or the Euro-Anglo power structure that we have. To maintain that, they need to have a philosophy or an ideology that pushes that status quo also.
And the fact that people are basically collateral damage, then, so to speak. I mean,
Yes,
if
so
that, if it means, you know, there are many people who die of poverty, if it means that there's many people that die for whatever reason it may be, then so be it, because there's
Well,
a
that
greater
brings
cause
me to
deserved.
man-made evil,
Mhm.
which they object to God's divine actions. Due to man-made evil, how many thousands of people die of starvation on a daily basis?
Yeah.
Due to corporate capitalism, how many people die on a daily basis? They won't mention distribution of wealth in Islam, where you have the yearly zakat being collected and distributed amongst the poor and the needy. All the corporations would be taxed. They would be taxed, and the tax would be distributed. The corporations would not be treated like a psychopathic individual. So in Western law, in 1855, for instance, you had the limited company, the idea of a limited company, removing the responsibility from the owners of the company to an entity known as a company, which is treated like an individual, but actually is not an individual. And this would mean there's no accountability for corporations. So these corporations are running amok in the world today, wherever they find resources, they plunder those resources, irrelevant to displacing of people, irrelevant to killing of people, and there is no accountability and there's no tax. But in Islamic governance, firstly, corporations would not be the corporation would not be treated like an individual. The individuals, meaning the board of members, the members themselves would be taken to court. Secondly, that corporation would be heavily taxed and limited in its scope of trade, meaning it would be limited. It's very important to understand this, because the British colonized India, our place of origin.
Mhm.
They colonized India through a corporation.
Yeah.
So, and that still happens today, where places and minds are being colonized with corporations. In fact, cultures are being stripped of their identity, where everyone wears Nike. So there's no. So some people think they are being unique when they follow a fashion or a trend, but the uniqueness finishes with uniformity. So someone may start with a punk hairstyle. They may think they are unique, but then when it becomes commonplace, it becomes uniformity. So there is a uniqueness in uniformity. So corporations also promote uniformity of the world, which in Islam there's diversity. You do not change someone's
Yeah.
culture and his language, or the only thing Islam affects in terms of that is the belief. And even then, the belief is not enforced on people also.
Yeah. And just moving on to chapter 3, which is proving the existence of God. And again, there may be some Muslims who argue that there is no need to provide proofs of the existence of God, due to believing in Allah is a basic belief contained within the fitrah. And it, of course, this has been advocated by people who promote Ibn Taymiyyah, and they've also used, for instance, the modern philosopher Alvin Plantinga's Reformed epistemology to show that believing in God is a properly basic belief. So, just going to ask, what do you make of this whole idea, this whole concept, and almost bringing they've almost tried to bring this back using Plantinga's properly basic belief as the fact that there's no need to prove the existence of God, the Kalam cosmological argument, contingency arguments. Uh, there's no need for any of that. You can get that all from the fitrah. The belief is purely from the fitrah. And look, we can make it relevant by using Plantinga's reformed epistemology.
Well, while that may be true, that someone is born with a fitrah, and this is something stated in the Quran, and it's a valid position. The problem with taking the position that there is no need for additional arguments is that in the modern world, we encounter various sophisticated counter arguments to our fitrah. So it's fitrah for us to understand that homosexuality is not natural. But what I mean by it's not natural is that a human being has a choice in order to follow through with that desire or not to follow through with that desire. But what is promoted today, especially with these lobby groups, LGBT lobby groups, is that we in our DNA and genetics, there is in some people homosexuality. Even of course, science has debunked this. This claim is debunked. People are not born homosexual, but through our fitrah, one of the early caliphs, he said, if I had not read, not the Al-Khulafa Rashidun, this is the later Banu Umayyah caliphs, so not even the rightly guided caliphs, one of the later caliphs, he said, if I had not read about homosexuality in the Quran, I would never have known such a thing exists, because he never came across this. His fitrah, his natural disposition, was unaware of this. So people who grow up in a natural environment, they can recognize God and some of his divine attributes. And when they come across revelation, the Quran, they can accept through the fitrah, the revelation. But in the time of globalization, we are exposed to so many various views and philosophies that sophisticated arguments need sophisticated counter arguments. So the fitrah argument can stand in a position if someone grew up in the desert and they did not encounter so many doubts. But in the modern urbanized world that we live in, the neo-colonialist world, the post-industrial world, we are exposed to so many various arguments that we need counter-sophisticated arguments, and this is where the role of Kalam is very important.
Yeah, and just to follow on that regarding the Kalam cosmological argument, what makes it better than, for instance, because you've mentioned in here, the intelligent design argument, fine tuning, and other arguments, modal ontological argument, the fitra properly basic belief one that we've just discussed. What makes the Kalam cosmological argument? Why did you choose that over, for instance, others?
The argument I actually chose, we would refer to as the argument from contingency. And the if you noticed, the style of argumentation that I've presented is different to what you find in English.
Yeah, it's different from Lane Craig's one.
Yes, so many people would think that the book is just a regurgitation of old material that is still found. So William Lane Craig being the most popular, interestingly enough, he wrote his thesis in Birmingham, the city of my birth. So he attained his degree from Birmingham. He took the arguments from Al-Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, and he sophisticated them through adding cosmology and so many different arguments from physics,
thermodynamics, and
thermodynamics and other things. And in his more recent work, meaning published in the past decade, the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology. But the arguments presented by myself, they seem to me watertight, that they cannot be refuted, irrelevant to the updates in science. So science itself is so unsure that recently there was an article on the BBC stating that so many things that we know with regard to physics we are not so sure about anymore. So it's something that's always shifting. So science does not reinterpret the data, because as I cover in chapter 5, with regard to epistemologically, where do we categorize science? So science, the type of science that we have in astrophysics, cosmogony, and all the various developments in physics, that science does not reinterpret the type of argument that I have placed from contingency. because the argument from contingency will always exist, irrelevant to which science you adopt. So scientists have multiverse theory. They have the attempt to combine quantum physics and quantum physics and relativity. They have this attempt to combine the two, but that does not affect the argument from contingency, because contingency, as I lay out, which is existence from non-existence, will always be found in any scientific theory that people may adopt, whether it becomes mainstream or not. So I started the argument from contingency. But one thing, at the beginning of chapter 3, I also covered the doubts and skepticism of David Hume. So it's a carry on from chapter 2. And David Hume's a Scottish.
He's from Edinburgh, though.
Yeah. David Hume was very influential. So he influenced not only Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant said he awoke him from his dogmatism, and then who was a German philosopher, and then he also influenced much of popular culture that we have today, or the popular skepticism that we have in Britain. So you mentioned skepticism being, or agnosticism being, the popular alternative to Christianity. That was heavily influenced by David Hume. But David Hume found early Greek works, which I mentioned also, and those Greek works were refuted by the likes of Al-Imam Sa'aduddin at-Taftazani and other scholars, where they refute these Greek philosophers and their various schools of skepticism. So I start the chapter from that, but then I bring it into contingency like Al-Imam Taftazani did. But I mention the modern adaptations of skepticism and the various scientific theories, but they do not affect the Islamic argument from contingency at all. And the argument itself is very watertight. If you remember the 7 principles that I mentioned, those 7 principles are covered by the likes of Al-Imam Sunusi, Al-Imam Ibrahim al-Bajuri. But then if you apply those 7 principles within any scientific theory, you can never fail with the argument from contingency. It's a totally watertight argument.
So, I mean, just moving on to chapter 4 now. I mean, there is a common misinterpretation which leads to kind of 2 extremes. One is, of course, declaring everyone unbelievers and them going to the hellfire. And the other one is, of course, religious inclusivists or perennialists. What is the Ash'ari position then regarding those who, for instance, haven't heard the message or have heard the message in a distorted form? Because this is something that is coming up time and time again, and I thought it'd be good just to flesh it out a bit.
Yes, so I covered this in chapter 4, that today we have politically motivated again, where you have apologists attempting to say that all religions are valid, but then you have the atheist objection that why would God confuse so many people with so many religions? And also with regard to salvation, ultimately salvation, individual salvation is only known to God Almighty. So only Allah can judge that such and such person will go to hell for eternity and such person will not. But the basic tenets of Islam are very clear in the Quran and Sunnah and consensus, that if those tenets of faith reach a person, they must adopt those and they become mukallaf. So if you remember, throughout chapter 4, I emphasize the meaning of mukallaf, legally obligated person, and and there are 10 conditions for someone to be determined as being mukallaf. 10 conditions are covered, like sound of mind, sound of health, in certain regards, sound of hearing and sight, that the transmission of the religion reaches such a person, This is mukallaf in the worldly sense, that the person, the Sharia applies to that person accordingly. So if they're living in a country which is governed by Islam, the person who is deemed as mukallaf will be governed according to what religion they adopt. So if they say they are Muslim, the rules of Islam will apply to them. And in fact, Sharia law mainly affects Muslims. So this is another misnomer where non-Muslims think Sharia law will be strict on them. Sharia law mainly affects Muslims. And this is one of the reasons for the Murtad law. The Murtad law, the law regarding the apostate, is strict because non-Muslims should think twice before entering Islam. This is one of the wisdoms, that if you have a Muslim majority country, some non-Muslims think, okay, let's become Muslim, we'll have it easy, even though it's easier for non-Muslims. But then they see the apostate law. They will not enter Islam as a hypocrite. They will enter Islam only if they genuinely believe in Islam. So this is one of the wisdoms which people fail to mention. But salvation in the hereafter, we have the broad principles. The broad principles in the Quran are that anyone who fulfills the conditions of taklif and they do not adopt Islam, they enter hellfire forever. So eternal hellfire is mentioned in the Quran. And this is the correct position in Islam. But this is an objection from the atheist. Why does God need to punish people eternally? And secondly, how do we know that someone specific is being punished for eternally? Of course, these questions are answered in the book. And there are other difficult questions covered in the book, like good people who are not Muslims. How do we know they will be punished eternally and not rewarded for their good? This is also tackled in the book. But the correct position is that the broad principle is that anyone who dies outwardly as a Muslim, we treat them as a Muslim, we pray their funeral prayer, we supplicate for them. And anyone who dies as a non-Muslim, we are not permitted by Sharia law to supplicate for them. We are not permitted in Sharia law to pray their funeral prayer. But ultimate judgment regarding the individual is by God, regarding the individual. As for the general rule, the general rule is very clear in the Quran, that only believers shall enter paradise, or those whom the message has not reached. So, وَمَا كُنَّا مُعَذِّبِينَ حَتَّى نَبْعَثَ رَسُولًا. We do not punish until we send a messenger. So this would answer the question people ask. All those non-Muslims who lived during the medieval times, who'd never heard of Islam, or when they did hear about an aspect of Islam, they only heard a distorted aspect. The Quran has answered that we do not punish a people until we dispatch a messenger. But then when the messenger reaches them, and they have the 10 conditions, the sound of mind, sound of sight and hearing in terms of receiving the message, and they become like Salman Rushdie or Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins, these are the type of people, if they die like that, they are promised eternal punishment. And then I cover also eternal punishment and the logicality of eternal punishment. In fact, you'll notice in chapter 4, even more difficult questions, like the question on why did God even create us in the first place if he knew that some of us will disobey him.
Yeah. That's it. Yeah. And just kind of leading on from that, that part of the chapter, we then kind of cover free will and the Islamic perspective of free will. I know it's well known that people like Harris, like Dawkins, Daniel Dennett seems to be confused himself, to be honest, on this issue. And Dawkins goes as far to say that the one who thinks that he has free will, they are in fact deluding themselves. What would be the response to this claim that there is no such thing as free will?
The free will mentioned in the Quran is a limited free will. So we have free will within our limited capacity, but everything else is determined for us. So Dawkins is advocating a total determinism where even the limited free will is being negated. So my free will to communicate with you is a free will within a limited parameter. This is something that is known self-evidently, meaning I do not need an external proof for this. The fact that I can lift my right hand and put my right hand down is a limited free will which we establish. Otherwise, everything else is determined, but we say determined by God Almighty. But even our free will, the overall ability to have a free will is created by God also.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, if for instance you were to say that, you know, ultimately then if you've got no free will, and which Dr. Harris is saying, and we're obviously saying that we do have free will, it's almost you've mentioned the term soft determinism in the book that we've got. I mean, we still have an impact on our lives, even though it may be limited. But for instance, with them, where they're saying that there is no such free will, and I just see the rise of nihilism. There's no meaning to anything that you do, and then you see how these have, real negative spillover effects. When you see the number of people that are depressed, you see the suicide rates climbing. I mean,
In Islamic history, we
it's a
had
real
this
problem.
Jabariya sect. The Jabariya sect, they denied free will totally. And as a consequence, the Jabariya fell into nihilism. This was a consequence of the philosophy, internal philosophy that they adopted. Intuitively, however, we can refute this claim of negation of free will intuitively by the fact of our limited actions that we do with our own volition. So, as I mentioned in the beginning of the book, that atheism is an actual assault on common sense.
Mm.
Atheism is an assault on common sense in the guise of intelligentsia, academia, and anything else that falls into that rubric.
Yeah, it's just, the more and more we kind of cover this, it's like, what kind of world would you want to live in, where it's utilitarianism, people are treated as collateral damage, nihilism is running rife, there's no objective morality, you make up your own morality. I mean, it's something for inshallah the
Well, what
listeners
they've
to
done,
think
they've
about.
tried equating historical religious persecution of various groups, comparing that with the modern Western society that we have.
Mm-hmm.
So, the Inquisition in Spain, the current regime in Iran, for instance, they'll mention that as an example, or Saudi Arabia. But in reality, and they'll compare it to modern Western democracy. Now, modern Western democracy, for instance, Britain, I would say Britain's moral principles are based on Christianity. Any goodness we find in this country, and thank God we have freedom of speech here, is because of Christianity, not because of atheism. And the goodness in Christianity is found from revelation from Jesus and from the previous prophets, which we agree with. So any goodness in the Western world has its roots in the Christian teachings, and the Christian teachings have their roots with the prophets, alayhimus salam, which we believe in. So atheism cannot claim the goodness of any goodness found in the Western world. They may claim it, but in reality, that the roots of that morality are found in Christianity. The immoral acts we find in the West, you'll find mainly, for the main part, they are found due to atheist philosophy and atheist ideology.
Yeah.
Like Mussolini, but they say Mussolini was a believer. but his fascism did not have any roots in Christianity. Or you had communist Russia with Stalin and all the Trotsky and all these other characters in Russia. And the number that were killed, and China today is an atheist country, communist China. So the Uyghur Muslims who are persecuted in China. So these arguments become very relative, depending from what perspective you are. But the main thing is that the morality needs to be set in stone.
Yeah. I mean, just going back to what you were saying, I mean, even Harris's good friend, Jordan Peterson, actually has this dispute with him where he says almost you can't kick the baby out the bathwater, so to speak, when it comes to religion. Religion has given you all these good things. You've built up your society. You're living in a Christian world, and now you can't say, okay, let's now get rid of religion, but keep all the good things that it gave us. So it's just interesting just to hear that, and the fact that as Muslims we have we believe that Allah is the objective moral lawgiver, and as you've mentioned, previously, the fact that we have an economic system which is a very strong economic system, and of course we have a very strong organized set of beliefs with things like the Kalam cosmological argument, which will ensure that, inshallah, that the religion is always relevant and that we always have proofs and evidences to back up our beliefs. But just kind of adding on to this regarding science now, so moving on to kind of chapter 5. And we'll see people who are even Muslim, for instance, who will deny miracles such as, the splitting of the moon. They'll say there's no evidence, for instance, that it ever happened. If something like the splitting of the moon occurred, you would see a crack, but look, you can't see a crack in it. I mean, how would we answer such statements that, denying miracles, basically? How would we answer people that deny miracles?
So there's two aspects to this. One is mixing rational judgments with empirical judgments. So rational judgments are judgments formed solely from the mind. Empirical judgments are formed from observation of the material world around us. The miracles are a violation of the norm of the physical, tangible world around us. So a violation of the norms of physics. These violations are not in contradiction to the rational judgment. So some people, for instance, say, oh, this is irrational, meaning a miracle is irrational. That's incorrect because they are mixing the two. For instance, a person in the medieval times, if you told him a metal can fly and carry so many human beings, they would say this is impossible. But today, in the 21st century, we know aeroplanes are made from metal and they carry hundreds of people. The medieval person would have made that mistake because they are mixing the norm of the physical realm with the rational judgment. So the rational judgment is what the mind alone, without any external observation, can tell you that this is impossible. So the miracles that we claim fall within the rubric of physical or material judgments, judgments relating to the external realm, not rational judgments, or they do not contradict rational judgments. Secondly, they only occur momentarily. So a violation of the norm will only occur momentarily. So therefore, it's beyond the scope of scientific investigation, which is fine for any scientist to reject it. But the third point, which is very important, is that in Islam, we say violation of the norm can also occur for a non-Muslim. This can occur. It's a possibility. But how do we make a distinction between a miracle of a true person and a false person? It goes back to rationality. That is the belief that they call for, the correct belief. So you have one man who's saying there is no God, and I will demonstrate that there is no God through a miracle. And you have another person saying there is a God, and I can demonstrate that there is a God through a miracle. And both perform a miracle. The first one, the non-Muslim, the miracle is termed as istidraj in Kalam, in theology. The other one is termed a mu'jiza of a prophet, a prophetic miracle. So this can confound a person, that the Dajjal has performed a miracle and the prophet has performed a miracle. How do we distinguish? It's based on the claim. So Dajjal's claim will be irrational. He claims God is a human being. He will claim that he is God. But the prophet has a true claim, which is that there is a transcendent God. So even the miracle is based upon the claim. And the claim is based, the truthfulness of a claim is based on the mind. So even miracles go back to the mind. So this is with regard to that. So I covered the Buraq, the interdimensional being that entered this domain momentarily and then left. This is beyond the investigation of science because it occurred momentarily. The splitting of the moon occurred momentarily. The various objections to that are answered in the book. But the main point is that the claim upon which those miracles were performed is what needs to be investigated. So the Prophet of Allah was claiming to be a prophet of God and God exists. That claim needs to be investigated prior to the miracle itself. So miracles occurring do not contradict science, and neither do they contradict the rational judgment. How they do not contradict science is that science is within the domain of what we refer to as physical laws and the norms relating to physical nature. So that's not denied by Islam.
Okay, thanks a lot for answering that. And just moving on, of course, to the next part, which is, of course, very popular, and alhamdulillah, it was great actually that you included this within chapter 5 and generally within the book, was evolution theory. And you've argued that Muslims don't have to accept evolution theory in its current form. So just wondering, could you explain why we don't have to
So I
accept
have to
evolution?
clarify that firstly, Islam has no contention with evolution theory as a whole, but it has a contention with specifics. What are the specifics? Human origins. So the Quran is very explicit with regard to human origins. And what I do in that chapter is I do not have pretensions of being a scientist. So I do not furnish the book with pseudoscience or creationist scientism, scientific thought, like the type of scientist thought presented by Discovery Institute in America.
Yeah.
I do not pretend to be a scientist when discussing evolution theory. I just frame evolution theory through the paradigm of Islamic theology. So we have a shelf of certainty, and within the shelf of certainty, human origins, as explained by Darwinian evolution theory, do not impart certainty from our epistemological view. And even scientists would agree to that to a degree. What they would say is that it's the best model for explaining human origins. But what we say, even though it's the best model for scientists, it does not impart absolute certainty because they have shifts with the discovery of a certain certain remains or anything to do with human origins. The scientific theory undergoes shifts. So it awaits a paradigm shift. And anything that awaits a major paradigm shift does not impart certainty for us. So anything that does not impart certainty for us would not change our doctrinal stance on certainties of the Quran. So an important point to mention here also is that there is no contradiction between absolute certainty in science and the Quran. But human origins do not fall into absolute certainty.
Mhm.
But evolution theory as a whole is probabilistic, and meaning the adaptation of creatures and the variance in creatures, this is probabilistic. And if Muslims hold this to be true, it doesn't affect their faith. But the issue for Muslims, or for mainstream Sunni Muslims, is the origins of Adam alayhi salam are mentioned with certainty in the Quran, and we know the origins of Adam alayhi salam with certainty from the Quran, and cannot be affected. The belief cannot be affected by evolution theory as it stands, because in the epistemological frame, it doesn't fall under absolute certainty, and you need something to be absolute certainty
Mhm.
for it to be compatibilized with the Quran. So this is what I was attempting to explain in that toward the end of chapter 5.
Yeah, alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. And it's yeah, you're absolutely true. I mean, even in the book review, I discussed things like we have other explanations, epigenetics and natural selection through genetic drift, natural genetic engineering. So yeah, I mean, it seems to be as you've mentioned, the Darwinian evolution seems to be the best model so far, but that's not to say that it's the only model out there.
It's not
And
equatable with Newtonian physics
Mhm,
or relativity, or meaning those scientific theories are different to how evolution theory stands. You see, an evolution theory, a scientific theory that is watertight, what will happen with that scientific theory is when a problem arises, that problem can be explained through the prism of that scientific theory,
mhm,
a problem relating to that particular field. So evolution theory has its good applications in biology and medicine, but none of that affects Islamic faith. So where Darwinian evolution theory is working in medicine or wherever, it doesn't affect our faith. But there are aspects of Darwinian evolution theory that do not impart certainty, but they are being promoted as absolute
yeah,
certainty, especially by Richard Dawkins. So we would not debate Richard Dawkins with regard to evolution theory as a scientific theory, but we would debate him with regard to its epistemological status and where it stands with regard to absolute certainty. Because for us, belief is only based on absolute certainty.
yeah. And it's actually, I mean, I felt it was very, very important to discuss that using the Kalam methodology, because as you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, it really does show the strength of the Kalam methodology, the fact that it can be used to evaluate these kind of claims that are being made by people like Dawkins and made by scientists even today, and really for the listeners and the viewers who are listening, you know, this is a case study, as the Sheikh has mentioned, into just how strong the Kalam methodology is, in the fact that it can withstand and uphold and evaluate even modern theories like evolution theory. So yeah, that's brilliant. And just to kind of finish with a couple of questions from chapter 6, and one of them was related to the preservation of the Quran. And I know, mashallah, you've got videos on this, but it's just because there have been a lot of attacks by Christians who are using this very famous expression that has been said by someone, which caused a lot of controversy and a lot of issues, that there are holes in the standard narrative of the preservation of the Quran. And this has unfortunately, led to Christians using this to attack Muslims, and Muslims who, for instance, haven't, studied the Islamic sciences, or haven't read up on the Qirat and the Ahruf of the Quran and the preservation of it all. uh, I've obviously this has led to them doubting whether the Quran is perfectly preserved or not. So I just thought, how would you answer that accusation that there are holes in the standard narrative?
Well, firstly, that particular individual that you mentioned, I did counter some of those arguments, and for the Christians to jump onto this in order to validate the historical preservation of the Bible is in fact hypocritical, because if we apply our rules to the Bible does not stand scrutiny in the way that the Quran stands to scrutiny. So this claim was based upon the preservation with regard to 7 ahruf and the qira'at. So the 7 ahruf are contained within the qira'at, even though there's a dispute as to the exact meaning of ahruf. What do the ahruf actually mean? There's over 40 statements. But then this person mentioned the qira'at, saying that the qira'at are, and the person is Dr. Yasir Qadi, but the 10 qira'at that there are holes in the preservation of the 10 qira'at, and how the Qurra preserve those qira'at. One example was tawatur, for instance. Mass transmission is not found in the qira'at. This claim is made by some academics, that they say, how can it be mutawatir when it's based on one muqri? That, like, Hafs is one muqri, and therefore this means that the qira'ah itself is not mutawatir. Of course, this is absurd, because what they mean by saying Hafs is not that the qira'ah is pivotal to Hafs. The qira'ah itself was mass transmitted in that time, but when they wrote down the qira'at, Shamsuddin ibn al-Jazari and Ash-Shatibi initially compiled 7 qira'at, and then Ibn al-Jazari completed that with 10, even though there were more. But what they meant by saying this is the qira'ah of Hafs is that this is one of the many qira'at, but we will base our narrative of the qira'ah upon Hafs. This is what they actually meant. So these people, meaning the argument is so ridiculous that even Dr. Yasir Qadi has written a book on Ulumul Quran. So someone like him should not be stating such type of things. This, what I am saying, is found in the classical works like Az-Ziyadat wal Ihsan fi Ulumul Quran. The author of that work mentions this point, that when they say the qira'ah of Warsh, it doesn't mean Warsh was alone in this. It was mutawatir in the time of Warsh, but they would select Warsh because he was the best reciter of that particular qira'ah. So the qira'ah became known as qira'ah to Warsh. Like in our times, Damascus, for instance, is filled with qurra today. So many qurra. But if we were to take qira'ah from one reciter, they have a Shaykh al-Qurra. So a Shaykh Quraym Rajih, who's still alive, over 90, was considered the Shaykh al-Qurra of Damascus. So if we take our sanad from him, and in 200 years from now, they say the qira'ah of Shaykh Quraym Rajih, it doesn't mean that that qira'ah was alone found uniquely with Shaykh Quraym. It was mutawatir, but we selected him for his because he taught for over 80, let's say he taught for over 70 years, and therefore he has a mastery like no one else. So these are the type of objections, or the claim that the manuscripts of the Quran contradict one another. Again, another fallacy, because the Quran in those days was not published as like a textbook. It was written down by individuals. So sometimes they would make some differences in how they would write down the rasm. So someone may add an alif. Like when we say Maliki Yawmiddin, someone may write Maliki with the alif. When it's not written with the alif, it's written with the mim, lam, and kaf. Some people some scribes may write down alif, these people will say that is a contradiction in the manuscript of the Quran. But again, that is also a fallacy, because they are writing the orthography still in accordance with one of the qira'at. Finally, on this issue, because this issue needs to be covered, which I have covered in depth in separate videos, but it's covered in the book also.
Yeah.
But a final point on this issue also is with regard to them saying the qira'at have not reached us through mass transmission. At least one qira'ah, they must admit, has reached us through mass transmission. For instance, qira'ah of Hafs. So even if one qira'ah has reached us through mass transmission, that would mean the entire Quran is preserved. And the memorization of the Quran through every generation alone is sufficient to refute all the claims. Because in every generation we've had, from the time of the companions, you had thousands of people who memorized the Quran, but then every subsequent generation, there were millions who memorized the Quran in a non-broken chain of transmission. That alone is sufficient to refute any arguments with regard to the Quran. But what I've noticed with Westerners is when they find an odd manuscript of the Bible, like in the cave of Qumran, they found the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Mm-hmm.
They become excited regarding some parchments that they may find. But they have nothing like the Quran in terms of every generation having millions of people who have memorized the Bible. This is uniquely found in the Quran. Unfortunately, Dr. Yasir Qadhi gives more credence to Western academia in how they approach Islam to classical Islamic scholarship. When it comes to Islam, the Muslim scholarship should be given more credibility with regard to their own heritage. So this is just one of those things that some people have inherited from in this post-colonial world that we live in.
Yeah. Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. That's yeah. I just thought it was important just to put that point in, because even though this issue has been going around for almost a year, we're still getting messages, I'm sure yourself as well, about this, and it keeps on popping up. So I thought it would be important just to clarify this. Just thought if I could get your final thoughts, Sheikh, just on how we should proceed with interacting and engaging with non-Muslims to answer their questions that they have about Islam. And also, just the sheer importance, if you can give some nasiha advice, inshallah, to Muslims on the importance of understanding their faith in the times that we're living in.
So with regard to the first point, most non-Muslims will have issues with Sharia law or with some of the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ. And these are the questions that some Muslims will find difficult to respond to. So those questions are covered in chapter 6. So with Sharia law, why do women need to wear hijab? Is there wife beating in the Quran? Meaning some people will find that difficult to respond, how to respond to such questions. Child marriage, is there child marriage in the Quran? These type of difficult questions. So it's essential for Muslims living in the modern world to know what their religion, what our religion says with regard to these questions. And those questions are answered in chapter 6. Secondly, with regard to your second question, if we have a rational basis for our faith, which this book intends to do, it intends to equip the modern Muslim with a rational basis for their faith. It will inculcate more confidence in their religion. And confidence is what Muslims today need. And therefore, I would sincerely advise everyone to acquire the book and read the book to inculcate confidence in their faith, that their religion has a rational basis. And in fact, those things which are being promoted today in order to tarnish Islam, when they read the reality, everything falls into place. meaning the like a jigsaw puzzle. The pieces will fall into place when they receive the correct response to those things.
Alhamdulillah. And I just wanted to mention as well the fact that it really is such a boon to have this book for Muslims. As the Sheikh has mentioned, it covers a lot of the typical questions that non-Muslims may use, and generally, things that they might not even be attacking Islam. They just want to know from you, what does Islam say about this? It really it is. I think it's a book which, if you would buy, it's also got immense readability in terms of. I really do think it's a book that you will go back to time and time again. It's not just a book that you will read once and then you'll put it back on the shelf. I think whenever you see issues come up regarding, as I said, the Prophet ﷺ's marriages or jihad or Sharia law or anything related to Islam, in regards to criticisms of Islam, you more than likely you will find an answer of that in this book. So I think it's a great thing to have, and it's a great piece of work to have in your homes, inshallah. So please do check it out. I'll leave a link in the description to Regio Publishing. I'll leave a link in the description to Madni Propagation, and also please do subscribe and follow Sheikh Asrar on Facebook, because Sheikh, you're running seminars on this book.
Inshallah, once the lockdown is eased, I will be holding seminars up and down the country. People are booking dates, inshallah. And when Scotland eases its lockdown, I'll be visiting you in Scotland as well, inshallah.
Inshallah. We'll go and see Mr. David Hume as well.
Well, we're not permitted to visit the graves of kuffar,
Yeah,
except to give them glad tidings of hellfire. But Allah knows best whether, as I said, individual salvation, Allah knows best.
yeah, absolutely. But yeah, so please do please do check it out. It's a great piece of work, and as the Sheikh was mentioning, that there will be seminars running up and down the country. So if you are in the United Kingdom, do just follow him on Facebook, and the posters will be there. And if there is one in your locality, or even if you have to travel a little bit, you've been locked in for over a year, I'm sure a little trip even up to Scotland will be inshallah definitely worth it, to listen to Sheikh Asrar and of course cover the book. So until next time, we'd just like to thank Sheikh Asrar. Inshallah, maybe we can have him on soon again, inshallah, to discuss something else. And until then, take care. Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.